This is Yewande Komolafe. You are watching TANTV Tastemakers.
TANTV Tastemakers is a curated stylish corner. Of our platform where we showcase distinct finds in the marketplace and help you make good choices about products and services by African and multicultural creatives known as tastemakers. Our goal is to bring you best relevant products and unique finds from creatives that you would never have discovered on your own. You'll discover products across various industries from fashion, beauty, food, wellness, cultural children's books, personal care, and
we have
more.
The pleasure of chatting with a unique diaspora tastemaker, Yewande Komolafe. Yewande is a cooking writer for the food section of the New York Times. She has worked in a number of roles in culinary world, including writing, recipe development, and food styling. Her culinary experience draws inspiration from her family's kitchen in Lagos, as well as her extensive experience in the restaurant kitchens across the United States. She crafts recipes that reflect her immigrant experience, focusing on flavor and texture. She's the author of Waffles Plus Smoky Get Cooking, based on the Netflix children's show, and her latest book, My Everyday Lagos Kitchen, Nigerian Cooking at Home and in the Diaspora. That's what I'm excited to dive into. So welcome, Yewande.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so great to be on here.
Yes, it's a pleasure to have you. So let's just kick off right away with your culinary background. What pulled you into recipe development and the exciting part, eventually even working for the New York Times?
Of course. So I have a background in science. I went to college and originally thought I was going to be a biochem major. I figured out really quickly that I didn't like chemistry. Eventually graduated with biopsychology and just decided to go into restaurant work. I have always loved food. I've always loved ingredients. It's something that I was always drawn to. And so I went to culinary art school, worked in restaurants, and while I was working in restaurants, I got to experience recipe development because I worked at a restaurant where our menu changed pretty frequently. And in recipe development, I found that like the scientist part of my brain was very activated and it felt like, oh, I was in biochem lab, but I was just working with food. And so that's how I got into recipe development. And after doing some recipe development, I started working in test kitchens. I started food styling, and that's sort of like the short version of the story of how I got to working with the Times.
That's interesting. All the way from biochem to...
I know.
they do have some similarities though. If you think of the curation and the kitchen and testing out things and all that. But one thing I found interesting about your story is how open you've been about your immigrant experience in the United States. You know, it's part of your story that you openly share about, from once being undocumented in the States to now being, from you didn't go home till like 18 years. You went back to Nigeria. And yeah. I'm curious, like that experience, how did that influence this new book, My Everyday Lagos, the cookbook?
I think I had to grapple with the question of what it means to be Nigerian if I haven't been back in so long. I was living here undocumented and asking myself this question, like, am I still Nigerian? Did I really grow up there? Like, am I making up these stories about growing up in Lagos? Because I hadn't gone back to like reconnect with my childhood. Yeah. And when I finally did get to go back, I was just flooded with a bunch of memories, and it felt like an overwhelming amount of nostalgia, and it felt like all the pieces of me that I had left in a bunch of different places were finally coming back together. And so like I'm open about my immigrant experience because I think it's something that people go through in the United States. It's not something that I personally heard a lot about, even though so many of my family members were going through the same process, but they would never talk openly about it. But I think I'm also just in this place where I'm living without shame, because it's not my shame or burden to carry the fact that I was undocumented. It's not something that I did to myself. And so I feel like being open and vulnerable just lets other people see their own stories reflected back to them.
That's so powerful. At what point did you sort of, like going back home, were you able to fully feel Nigerian again?
I think that's a question.
Years away, and now creating a cookbook as powerful as this, talking about my everyday Lagos, how reconnected did you feel, or are you still in that space where you're like, okay, I'm there, but or I'm almost there, so to say?
I think it's an evolving question for me. I land in different places. I grew up in Nigeria, but I was born in Berlin. And so we came back speaking German as my first language. And the extended family were like, oh my God, they're the European kids. They can't eat spicy food. Like, don't give them that to eat. And so I think that the question of being Nigerian and how Nigerian I am, it's just always something I'm going to grapple with for as long as I live. I might get to different stages of it. Right now, I just feel like I'm Yoruba, like I'm hardcore Yoruba, and that's kind of where I've landed. But I think it's just going to be an evolving thing for me, like how Nigerian I feel. It's just, and I define my own identity by just saying that I am as Nigerian as I want to be. Like nobody else defines it for me. Like I'm Nigerian because I have that experience. And so nobody gets to define it for me. I get to define it for myself.
That's beautiful. There was an article that you did for the New York Times. I think it was like 10 recipes.
The 10 essential recipes of Nigerian.
10 essential recipes of Nigerian culture or something. Yeah. And that piece went, I would say, viral in a way. And it sort of took off in a beautiful way. And then how do you grapple with the fact that some people feel, rightfully Nigerian, in the sense of they sort of claim the recipe as you cannot deviate from this, like how this is how you make, you know what I'm saying, like there's no other way of making jollof rice, or there's no other, and they're so stuck on it. And so when you see some of those comments and criticism about your version and your style of cooking versus what other people feel is the traditional way, how do you grapple with that, and how do you
that's a great question.
Your identity through
so I used to have these dinner parties where I'll have people come over to my house, and just like strangers, I would send out an email and like people would respond, and I would be like, okay, we have 20 people for dinner tonight. And sometimes Nigerians would come and they would eat my food, and they're like, this is not how we make it in Nigeria. This is not how my mom makes it. And I'm just like, that's all fine and good, but like, this is how I make it. This is how I express the food. This is how, like, the food is Nigerian because I'm making it. And that's just it, And as far as like recipes, how Nigerian are my recipes? I don't know. Like I think that recipes are not static. Recipes are an evolving concept. I don't think that I make akara the same way you would make it in your kitchen in DC, And I love that people feel so powerful about how things should be. But honestly, I don't think that if we're honestly speaking, everybody makes it the same way. I think people make it according to their preference, and that's how I cook. I make it according to my preference. I like a lot of spice. I'm going to put a lot of spice in my food. I like a lot of green onions. I'm going to put a lot of green onions in my food. And so I don't I don't really think of recipes as something that should be unchanging. I think of recipes as not static and always evolving. Even in Lagos, the food evolves, you know? I go back home and they're like, oh, we don't do it like that anymore. Like, that's like the old way of doing it. So I think of it as like an ever evolving concept.
I
appreciate the engagement.
That's it. Because, people feel strong ownership to food, especially. And I imagine that, because honestly, when you're in that space on a big platform like the New York Times, you're really putting yourself out there, right? You're putting your whole self there. Like, this is me. Do you ever feel some type of doubt at any point when you're thinking about a recipe or working on a recipe and you have to like put it out? Do you ever second guess, like, am I doing it the right way? What will people say if I miss a step or any of? Because I just think like it's, let me
I think I trust my own creativity. I trust my experience. I trust who I am as a cook. And so I think that those questions to me don't really faze me. I do want to make sure that I'm honoring the food, because I'm Yoruba, I'm not Fulani. So if I'm making Fulani food, I'm gonna ask someone who's actually from there. I'm gonna like reach out to people who are from there, reach out to people who have experienced the food more than I have, and include them in the story. But in tweaking recipes and in developing recipes, I lean back on my own experience. I do my research. I think research is very important. I do my research to make sure. I think there are like core elements of recipes that, like if you're making mian taushe and you're like, I'm not going to put pumpkin in it, I'm not going to put granite in it. And it's just like, well, that's not going to be, like, it's literally a pumpkin and granite soup. Like, so that's not going to be mian taushe. So, I think there are tweaks that you can make here or there, but I think that you still have to honor the people, the stories behind the recipes. I think those are important. And do your research. Like, make sure you research what you're doing to make sure you get it correct. You can tweak a recipe, but you can't deviate from what it is. Like, there are essential and core elements to what a recipe is. And if you don't put those in, then you're making something completely different. Or tell us why you changed it. If you do decide to change it, like, we deserve to know why. Like, the people deserve to know.
I agree with you. And, let's talk about collaboration, right? Yeah. Collaboration, from what you just said, seems to be a big part of, a big aspect of your work. Now, can you sort of discuss maybe some of the memorable collaborations that you've had with certain chefs or in restaurants, restaurateurs, for perhaps maybe this cookbook or even other projects that you've done?
So during the writing process of this cookbook, I realized that my publishers acquired the cookbook and they're very happy to have me, but they don't have the background in the subject matter that I'm talking about. So I could have been like, mangoes grow as a shrub in the bush, and they would have been like, oh my God, Yewande, so great, amazing, And so I built a team of people from the continent and from the diaspora to read the manuscript to make sure that the things that I was saying were correct. To give me that critical piece of thinking. Also, the cover of the book was done by a Nigerian artist. The photography, the location photographers was done by Lola Akimade, who lives in Sweden, but she's taken really beautiful shots of Lagos. I really wanted it to reflect the community aspect in cooking that we have. And so putting this book together was kind of a collaborative thing. I wrote the recipes and I did the writing, but every other piece and every other aspect of the book was a collaboration with people across the diaspora and in Nigeria.
So, I want to talk about some of the recipes that reflect the immigrant experience. Can you share examples of some particular dishes or examples of dishes that embodies like the fusion of flavors and texture? And here's what I want to really understand your particular style of cooking, right? Because just like we talk about, staying true to the dish or finding, to the core recipes of the dish, right? There's some like restaurants, I guess I would say recipe developers or food writers and all that they do this fusion thing, right? Like you could see like egusi and they'll call it something else on something else. Like it's a fusion of something, right? So how do you, what is your own style? Is it fusion? Is it traditional? And then maybe share some couple of recipes that you've worked on.
Okay, so I think specifically with this cookbook, I went with the classic cuisine because I kind of wanted to start at the beginning for myself and for my readers, because I was examining Nigerian food after being away for so long, and I knew how to make stew, I knew how to make pounded yam, I knew how to make eforiro, but I didn't know why we were making it like that. Like, why do we fry palm oil? Why do we mix palm oil with, say, kaung to like give a sauce? And so I really wanted to understand the reason behind the way we were cooking, the way we layer flavors, the spices that we use. Like, I know I can buy pepper soup spice that's already ground, it's already mixed, but like I wanted, like, what's in pepper soup spice? I don't know. I asked my mom and she's like, I don't know, it's a bunch of spices. I'm just like, okay, well, that doesn't help. And so I wanted to do a deep dive into like the elements of our cuisine. So starting from just like the basic ingredients and starting from like the it's almost like an introduction to, it's like Nigerian food 101, and so understanding it in that way, I feel, gives me the flexibility and the experience I need if I ever wanted to do a fusion style cooking, because I can understand that, like, if I'm making mian tao she, I can't make it without granite and I can't make it without pumpkin, because those are the essential elements to that soup. Whether I use peanut oil or whether I use vegetable oil, that's up to what I have in my cabinet, Whether I put meat in it is up to my taste. And so I needed to understand the essential elements of our cooking before I felt like I could be courageous enough to like mix and like do all kinds of fusions.
I could see that. So basically, it's like you said, the 101 of Nigerian. So people can trust that getting your cookbook gives them that classic.
It's just like the classic. It's like what we ate on Saturday mornings was either moi moi and ogi or akara and ogi. If someone passed on, my grandmother would send us a newspaper rolled up with akara inside, It's like baby naming. When I had my kids, it was like, why are we breaking kola nut? Why am I putting honey on their lips? Like, I know we do these things, but like, why are we doing them?
Let's talk about everyday Lagos. I'm going to read a quote from one of the interviews that you did with Eater. On my Everyday Lagos. It says, the cookbook is a portrait of a city's palette and the little girl who grew up experiencing it before circumstance kept her away, her imagination morphing her picture of the Lagos she once knew. Komolafe extracted many of these recipes by digging into my memory of my family members who are now ancestors. And what can you say about this quote?
So ever since I started going back, I realized I'm spiritually Yoruba. Like, I don't call myself Christian because I don't really believe in that version of God. And I really believe that we are, like, whatever we're supposed to do in life, we will do it here in this life. I feel like I move through the world as a spirit learning to be human. And so while writing this book, I had many instances, and just like in my life in general, I had many instances where I would be sitting writing, and then like my grandmother, who I hadn't thought about in so long, would just like come to my mind, and I would have this memory of her sitting in her backyard, either like grinding pepper or like making akara or making gosh, I can't remember the name of that dish, the dish with like the grated yam. I had so many instances like that. Jojo, exactly. And so like some of the head notes reflect that process, because it was literally like my grandmother speaking to me about how she makes that dish. And these were things I hadn't really thought about in, I don't know, 18 years, you know? And so it's hard for me to explain why all of a sudden in the process of writing the book, I'm having these memories or I'm having these like flashbacks. And so that it was such a spiritual process writing this book. It was also me talking about a lot of things that I hadn't openly discussed. I feel like everything is now in one place. And if people want to get to know Yewande, they should just pick up the book and read my essays in there.
I think it's beautiful because you also touched about your brother, and I could see the vulnerability it took to also put this book together. I feel like this is a sort of shedding, and I might be right. The energy I get from your book, it feels like a sort of coming home, you know, and a shedding of like, okay, I am fully me. Right? Yeah,
and absolutely.
Yeah. Can you talk a bit about, you know, why you felt this freedom to open up about your story and even your story too?
Yeah, I think it's just being in that place where I don't subscribe to other people's shame about circumstance. There's nothing shameful about having sickle cell anemia. There's nothing shameful about living undocumented. There's nothing shameful about grief. And I think I was just ready. Like, I think it's just timing, honestly. Like, I don't know if I had tried to write the book like 5 years ago, if I would have been that open or vulnerable. I think it's timing. I think I'm just in a place in my life where, you know, I'm raising 2 daughters here in the US, and I want them, like, they have my last name. They both have Yoruba names, and I want them to grow up in a space without shame, because I know the way shame impacted my life. And so I think it's just living without shame.
I love that. What challenges would you say you encountered in putting the cookbook together?
Oh boy. Well,
how many years? Was it more than two years?
Yes. So typically it takes about 2 years. It took me about 3.5 years. At some point I put the project down and I just was like,
after 1 year.
I was like, I'll give them back their money. I don't want to do this anymore. Gosh, like a cookbook on Nigerian cooking in this way, in this classic sense. In my research, the ones that I found were like the books that we use for home economics in primary school or secondary school. And so they were very like academic leaning. It wasn't really involved in recipes. Like the recipes didn't really work. And so like the references took work, and the references, like I wasn't referencing a book about baking or a book about pasta. I was sort of like creating new structures. And that was another thing. Like I felt like our food doesn't fit into Western structures. And I had to just present it exactly as it was. And the people who would recognize it would recognize it. You know, I didn't want to explain myself. I didn't want to have to explain Iru is a fermented locust bean paste that's used across Nigeria. Like, I didn't want to go into all that. Like, I just wanted to talk directly to people who know what I'm talking about without having to explain myself. Because I know that there's that audience out there. I know there's Nigerians and West Africans in the diaspora and in Nigeria who can understand exactly what I'm saying. I wanted to talk to them directly. And so it took a lot of back and forth with the publisher and getting them to understand my mission and who I was trying to center in these stories. Because I wasn't trying to center white people or like the American person. I was centering Africans in my story. And that in itself is somewhat new in the cookbook world. So there was a lot of like back and forth with the publisher, trying to get them to understand my vision. And that's why it took so long. And that's why I felt exhausted after like trying to work on it for a while. And I was like, take your money back. I don't want to do this anymore.
Well, you were bold. You were bold to go in that direction.
You think so? I feel like I can't, like, we come from Nigeria. It's like, we're...
Well, both people will tell you, because like, for instance, when you do a project like this, and I've talked to a lot of restaurateurs on this platform, and when people open restaurants, for instance, right, I feel like when we're trying, there's growth in the restaurant industry of Africans in restaurant, right? And particularly catering to one aspect of culture or region, right? So you have like Nigerians who open a Nigerian restaurant, quote unquote. But then what I found mostly is that there's something missing, and something missing in the sense of, who are you trying to feed, right? Because and the menu keeps changing, and it's like a dance, because they're trying to discover, am I trying to feed like Nigerians who already cook at home? Why should they cook different? Why I cater to the American palate and burgers and make it fusion style? So there's all that confusion, which is fine, because I think at the end of the day, you're investing in the business and all that. So I can imagine for you being strong and saying, you know what, there's a gap in this space, and I am here to fill that gap, to document the classic Nigerian cuisine, right? And put the essentials together in a recipe book. Now, every other person or party can argue like, oh, why, if I'm Nigerian, why do I need a cookbook? But who is documenting that? Documenting, these are the key recipes, or these are the classic recipes or food. So that's why it's really bold step.
Well, thank you for saying that. Another thing that I would say while working on this book is that my idea of what recipes look like completely changed, because I realized that we're an oral culture, and I feel like there's a space to honor that as well. It's nice that I put these recipes in a book, but without this book, like, Nigerian food exists. It will continue to exist. My grandmother cooked Nigerian food, Yes. It's nice that it's now in a book, but I also want to honor the fact that I was able to write a book in 2023 of recipes my grandmother has been making since like the 50s and 60s, and that's because of how rich our oral culture is. And so there's a space, I feel like, for written history, there's a space for an oral history. I don't think one is better than the other. I don't pit one against the other. I think that I'm just saying that we should honor all aspects of how we document this process.
I love that. And talking about the recipe, when we cook, we gauge.
Yes. That like hand motion.
It's just like, the sauce.
Yes.
Like, right? So how did you sort of come to terms with trying to put down, two atarodo?
So that process was also interesting, because at the end of the day, I'm like, who am I doing this for? Like, I'm hoping that you will pick up the book in DC and make the recipe and it would work. But my inclination is that when you pick up the recipe, you're like, I only want one atarodo. Like, I don't want two, and I love that. Like, I feel like recipes are alive. They're living, breathing things, but how I did that, I just had to fall back on my experience. So I trained as like a chef. Like, I went to school for it. I'm a scientist. Like, I make coffee in the morning and I pull out my scale, because I don't know how much coffee goes with how much water. Like, I need my scale for that. And so that aspect of it is something that I actually really enjoyed. It just spoke to like the scientist in me. It's like, okay, if I'm making stew, how many like peppers do I actually use? How many onions do I actually use? My mom would be like, just 1.5. Like, but is it like 1.5 of a big onion or of a small onion? Like, what are we talking about here? And so there's some comedy to that part, that aspect of it. I try to like find a balance where I'm not giving like everything in precise, like 1/4 cup this, in precise measurement. And so I found a balance where I was just like, okay, like taste it. If you want more salt, if you want more pepper, add it, And so, but that was a fun aspect of it, was like trying to figure out exactly how much is going into the pot.
So I guess we can trust that whenever you pick up the cookbook, you can still kind of curate it to your own,
to your taste. That's exactly what I want everybody. Yes.
Yeah, that's
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. For okay, before I go to this next question, let's talk about this recipe. What's it called? Akara.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about akara recipe that you have in the book.
Yes.
Can you give us an idea of the how you kind of formulated that recipe? What was the inspiration behind the akara recipe for you? So it's still
of course.
Yeah.
So the akara is in a chapter that I call weekend and celebrations, or weekend and ceremony, because akara to me was like celebration food. Or like food to mark an event. Like with my grandmother, if someone passed in the family, she would make akara and send it to everybody. If there was a new child born, she would make akara and send it to everybody. And so I associate akara with like events happening in the family. And so I put it in the chapter that's all about like celebration food. But akara is basically a bean fritter. It's a pureed bean fritter, and so it's actually a really simple recipe. I think that what people get wrong is how much water to add. I like akara that's like crackly on the outside and kind of crunchy, and then like nice and tender on the inside. And the way I achieve that is by just curating the amount of water that goes into the batter. And so I soak my beans. I have 2 different ways you can make it. You could soak the beans, peel them, grind them, add your aromatics like onion, pepper, whatever you want to add to it, some salt, or because we live in the diaspora, and I think this is available also in Lagos, but because we live in the diaspora, there's bean powder. So you could just get bean powder, add some water to it, add your chopped onion and diced scotch bonnets to it, and fry it that way. And so you can make it 2 different ways. I think the important part about making akara is that you eat it while it's hot.
Yes. Yes,
that's the most important thing.
And you pair it with ogi, and that's
you pair it with ogi, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Now I'm hungry. Listen.
Yeah.
Yeah. For immigrants and the part of the diaspora that are feeling a sense of, would I say, identity misplaced or of home, how do you hope that it relates with this book?
I hope they're able to see themselves in the pages, because I grapple with that in the book. When I talk about not being able to go home, when I talk about like landing in Nigeria and those people at the airport are like, welcome to Lagos. And I'm like, oh my God, they're welcoming me. They're talking exactly to me, So I hope that they're able to see themselves reflected in my story, because that's my story. My story is an immigrant experience, and I grapple with that question every day.
Yeah. Do you consider yourself as now living the American dream? And what would you advise anyone battling with immigration issues and trying to also pursue that American dream?
I don't know that the American dream exists. I don't think it's a reality. So no, I don't consider myself living the American dream. I think I'm at a place where I don't have to worry about survival every single day. Like
you're working for the New York Times, like American dream.
I think I'm in a very privileged place now, compared to where I was about 6-7 years ago. But I don't think that I ever trusted the American dream as inclusive enough.
Yeah.
I think that anyone grappling with status issues, immigration issues, I would say find a community that understands you and sees that and can support you, because that's what I did throughout the time that I was undocumented, is that I had a really strong community around me, a community of like family and chosen family. And that was how I got through it. I did not do it alone at all. Like I got through it with the help of my community.
Yes. So we're towards the end of this beautiful, exciting conversation. I want to go on and on because
I know, same. I can talk to you all day.
I'm personally curious and excited about this. But I want to touch just lastly on the Nigerian and African cuisine gaining popularity globally, right? What aspects, what do you see or what do you predict as even just with your insight, right? In terms of food and culture and how global we've become, with African restaurants popping up here and there. What is your take on this new, I don't know if I'll call it new, but this affection now for African cuisine, and just now it's cool to be African, so to say?
It's interesting because I think that, to me, Nigerian food is something I've always had. It's always been mainstream to me, like Lagos alone has 20 million people. So the idea of Nigerian food not being mainstream, I'm not able to, I've always eaten Nigerian food wherever in the country I am. I remember driving across the country, across the US with my husband, and we found a Nigerian restaurant in New Mexico. We everywhere we stopped, there was a Nigerian restaurant and there was a Nigerian market. And so the idea that it's now more popular, it's now in common speak, I don't know if I believe that. I feel like it always was. But were other people paying attention, or who were they paying attention to? I think those are the questions that we should be asking. I think that it's always been there. It's always been present. But the question is really, who was the media paying attention to? Who were restaurant investors paying attention to? I think those are the questions, and not necessarily whether it's now trendy to be to me, it was always trendy to be Nigerian.
What do you think is the future of African fine dining in America?
Fine dining specifically?
Yes.
I don't know. I'm eager to see. I'm excited. I think that I want to continue to go to different cities and be able to get Nigerian food. To me, that's okay, once I've had my jollof rice and my burrito, and if you put moi moi on top of it, that's perfect. If I'm able to get that anywhere I go, I think that's a pretty good future for me.
All right, so let's do this rapid fire and then we wrap up. So okay. I'm going to stand this sitting position. Okay, so rapid fire. I think I don't even have it written down, but I'm just going to come up with something. Let's see. So let's do 5 questions if I can think of five.
Okay.
All right, let's go. So I guess you would just say one word or a sentence or one word.
Okay. I'll try to keep it short.
Okay. Yeah. Home means
homemade.
Home means what?
Oh, homemade ogi, from scratch. Homemade ogi. Get your corn, ferment it, grind it, and make your ogi. My
everyday Lagos is
out October 24th.
I love that. I am a tastemaker because
I love food and I love ingredients.
I see myself in 5 years doing.
Oh gosh, 5 years. That's a hard one. I'm not sure. It remains to be seen.
And okay, TANTV shout out.
Oh yeah, TANTV. This was such a great interview. This is going to be more than one sentence, but this was so lovely to talk to you. Thank you.
Awesome. Same here.
Thank you.
Question: what does the future hold for you? Are you going to get into the restaurant business?
I don't think I'm going to go back into the restaurant industry. I did that for about 10 years. I worked in restaurants. But that was never my goal to own a restaurant or to like do food production. I'm more interested in just telling our story, either by writing, by podcast, or video, documenting. I'm more interested in like documenting our stories. And so that's kind of where my focus is right now. This is Yewande Komolafe. You are watching TANTV Tastemakers, and you can get a copy of my book, My Everyday Lagos, anywhere books are sold.
I am putting this call out to you. If you have a product that you would love for more people to see, this is the place for you. So visit us at tantvstudios.com for more. Okay, that's it. Are we good?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Amazing.
Yewande, this was so much fun.
This was so lovely. It's so great to meet you.
Same
Thank
here.
you.
Same here.